deep in the heart of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A storm of startling secrets and terrible truths shock a close-knit community and fracture a family. With murder.
I still get emotional recounting this whole saga.
A lot of people were visibly upset and crying about what had happened.
There had been a lot going on behind the scenes for months that no one was really aware of.
The hidden secrets and deadly deceptions hide unthinkable crimes.
It was right under our noses and we didn't even know.
Lies untangled, tragically released.
It was shocking.
Nobody knew what had happened.
Who did it?
We don't know who this person is.
It's scary.
And why?
There was a lot of twists and turns to this case.
But nobody knows the real, twisted, sick, dark truth.
A secret to die for. In southern United States, on the banks of the Mississippi River, is the culturally rich city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Baton Rouge it's a great city. It's the capital of our state of Louisiana. There's lots of culture.
The reason people love it here is the food, the people.
It's a great place to live.
This exciting, eclectic locale attracts many people, including Scott Rogers.
Scott Rogers was a very flamboyant and charismatic person. Everybody loved his personality.
He was a charismatic type of person.
Scott was drawn to the rich culture of Baton Rouge for new and bigger opportunities, leaving his UK life behind.
In Bury St. Edmunds, England, Scott Rogers had started a performing arts academy with his former wife. He taught dance, they taught acting lessons, public speaking.
And I think at one point they had almost 800 children enrolled.
Scott loves his new home in the US, and it isn't long before his daughter, Kimmy, and two members of his extended family, Matthew and Stuart, join him in Baton Rouge.
From all appearances, Scott and the family seem to be doing very well. He bought a large house just south of Baton Rouge.
And it was a beautiful home.
And then after a period of time, Scott decided to adopt a little boy.
The adoption process is pretty straightforward. Fill out the paperwork and give a needy child a loving family.
And they were all living together in Scott Rogers' home.
And it was certainly large enough for all of the people that they had living under that roof. And Scott Rogers appeared to be the happiest person on earth.
But Scott and his family are harbouring shocking secrets and lies that are festering just below the surface.
It was right under our noses and we didn't even know the truth.
As Scott and his family embrace their new life in Baton Rouge, it isn't long before Scott begins making a name for himself around town.
Scott Rogers was very liked in the Baton Rouge area and the community. He was very involved in the church. He would help with charity events and anywhere and everywhere he could. People loved him.
To make money and help local charities, Scott starts a video production company, and everyone chips in.
It was a family-run business.
Matthew and Stuart, as well as Kimmy, were all involved in his production company.
Scott and his family produce promotional videos for several non-profits and charities in Baton Rouge. But the ambitious business owner has a secret desire.
He wanted to get in front of that camera.
After Scott was in Baton Rouge for a period of time, he started producing a television show.
He did a local TV show called Around Town on Saturday mornings.
The Around Town show continues now with all the good and positive in our community.
Scott had his family helping him. Stuart did pretty much most of the filming. Matthew ran the business.
And his daughter Kimmy works as Scott's assistant and receptionist.
He liked to bring people on to do a cooking segment. He had segments on there where people performed.
And over time, he built up an audience for the show itself, and he became more of a public figure within the community by jumping off of that show.
He was such an upbeat person, and people around Baton Rouge and surrounding areas, they loved him.
He was funny. In the day and age we live in, it's nice to just lay low and let the stress go and just laugh and smile. It just felt lighthearted that I wanted to keep watching.
Their studio was actually located in an old shopping mall here in the city. The cameras were top-notch, the latest technology. The lighting was professional. The sets were professional. Everything about it was first-rate.
That's when he really started getting a following.
And his show begins to attract more high-profile guests.
Scott was very, very good at bringing guests onto the show who had some sort of level of influence. Law enforcement executives from various agencies, public officials, congressmen, governor, the district attorney, and he would let them come onto his show and plug whatever they wanted to talk about.
Congressman, it's always a pleasure and an honor to have you on our show.
Hey, Scott, it is great to be here.
So at this point, Scott has become somewhat of a known entity in the community. He's something of a celebrity. He's on television every week. He's showing up at different events.
Not sure if you caught the Dunham Jazz Ensemble around the corner as you came in. Amazing, talented group.
People did look at him as a local celebrity in Baton Rouge.
Scott finds a way to expand his audience even further and help his community.
He got invited to preach a sermon at a non-denominational church here in Baton Rouge. He looked around and saw this congregation that received him very well, and he thought, I can do this.
Scott loves the thrill and respect of preaching and decides to follow his newfound calling.
He got ordained online, and then he opened his own church.
Now, Scott Rogers, the man around town and local TV celebrity, is also Pastor Scott.
And first service, I'm told he had 50 to 60 people show up at his church.
He had the gift of gab, naturally, because to start a TV show and obviously start a church, you have to be able to speak to people.
He's also now becoming a religious leader.
It's at this point when Scott would bring in someone that will become an integral part of his professional and personal life.
Maria Edwards was co-pastor of the church with Scott, and she helped bring other people into the church and put together the sermons and the program that the congregation would see each week.
She and Scott had an extremely close relationship. She was in charge of financials for the church. Basically, she was in charge of everything.
Maria Edwards was frequently at Scott's home on weekends. They had big family meals. They got together for holidays together. She was very much part of the family.
But how well does Scott really know his new friend and business confidant?
There are just certain types of people that you're suspicious of.
A lot of people do have secrets. What you see is not always the way somebody really is.
Scott's facing a similar issue. His increased public presence is beginning to raise eyebrows.
I just thought, there's more to this guy. I thought that his persona as he presented it was just completely false. But a lot of people did not share that opinion.
Scott Rogers has built a powerful public life for himself and for his family. But disturbing questions and painful secrets will tear it all apart.
There's a deep, dark secret that is about to come to light.
Scott Rogers has built a good life in Baton Rouge. With his family, he runs a successful TV production company and a local church.
He's something of a celebrity. and he's very involved in the community.
Scott is also a foster parent and eventually decides he wants to expand his family even further.
He decided he wanted to adopt a second little boy. And he went on his TV show saying, I'm adopting a second child, and as soon as the adoption's final, I'll have him on the program so you can all meet him.
Scott fills out the boy's adoption papers, and it's not long before he welcomes him into the family.
He was recognized by the Department of Children and Family Services for fostering children in his home.
To the public, he was a good person. People looked up to him. He was highlighting the good in the community. He was bringing to light the nonprofits, giving to the charities. He's a perfect parent.
He presented himself in a way that was very positive and civic-minded, and over time, he had built up quite a network of people, both personally and professionally, who thought very highly of him.
Many of them are invited to appear on Scott's TV show to discuss important social issues.
Wherever there was a powerful politician or somebody who held a powerful office, he was right there.
He invited elected officials, from the governor to statewide elected officials to the mayors. I mean, anybody in any prominent role in the community that he could get on the show, he brought in. He just fawned all over them.
Which he did shamelessly. He showered people with praise and sat there and told them how wonderful they were and stroked their egos on this show. And then what he did with all of these networks he formed is that he created this aura of legitimacy and respectability.
Scott begins to utilize these new, powerful political connections for his own financial benefits.
He tried to really expand by getting contracts with politicians to do their political campaigns or whatnot, any video services that they needed.
Scott's plan works. He's approached to co-produce a series of public education videos for Homeland Security on how to prepare for natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. The contract will be shared between Scott and a local company owned by Rana Gray.
Rana is a fairly well-known person in this community in political circles. She has a background in public relations and politics and campaign management.
My business partner and I had a small public relations firm in Baton Rouge. The director of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness asked me if we'd be comfortable working with him, and my business partner and I said sure. So we ended up working on this project with Scott Rogers' company.
But afterwards, their relationship becomes soured when Scott reveals a more unscrupulous side.
Our client discovered that he was taking the same content and reselling it to the state emergency operations center. So this content was basically being paid for twice.
Even more brazen and personal, Scott keeps the final $15,000 payment owing to Rana's PR firm that he collected.
He was refusing to hand over our fees. He was keeping them.
He pretty much scooped it all from beneath her by getting all the money, then refusing to give her her part of the money.
It was just very upsetting.
And this is where it gets ugly and public.
It resulted in a lawsuit being filed over non-payment of monies.
He was so mad that he was able to get the local newspaper to write a story where he claimed that he was forced to work with me and just saying lies about us. I mean, to me, it was slander. I was so angry about this because your entire livelihood and profession depends on you maintaining a reputation.
To defend herself and her company's reputation, Rana fights back.
I wrote a letter to the editor to try to correct it and set the record straight.
It was really the only recourse she had.
The newspaper publishes Rana's rebuttal. But her letter calling out and naming Scott Rogers does little to tarnish his squeaky clean image.
He was important, and he had a lot of important friends.
Why would anybody question somebody who was a pastor in a church?
But he had a dark side that no one here knew.
The shiny veneer of Scott Rogers' public persona seemed to be chipping away for some, But for Scott, building pressure and secrets only intensifies his resolve.
I had no idea the lengths he was going to try to destroy our firm. He was calling people at night, urging them to not work with us.
This is not the Scott Rogers from television.
It was just another part of the psychology of Scott Rogers. It was just part of the craziness.
But little does Rana know, her letter will set off a chain of events that will expose startling secrets. One day, when Scott Rogers is away from home, a life-changing disruption to his illustrious life comes crashing down on him in a very personal and devastating way.
Scott Rogers had custody of 2 foster kids, and Child Services removed them from Scott's home.
The kids were taken away from him, and Scott was very distraught, and he felt like his world was crumbling.
What is going on, and what deception, lies and hidden truths are threatening to be revealed?
You think that this is a great person, but behind those closed doors is a very dark secret.
And it may only just be the beginning. Popular TV host and church leader Scott Rogers is devastated after his 2 foster children are removed from his home.
Child Services said he had improperly filled out his paperwork. That's what led to Child Services taking the kids.
You know, I'm sure there were many questions and many untruths told on his application to even get these kids. And so once all that is revealed, it is Child Services' main priority and obligation to remove those children for their safety.
It's a publicly humiliating and troubling situation for Scott Rogers.
He was very distraught.
Scott Rogers gets Maria Edwards, his lieutenant at the church, to do a conference call with some of the parishioners and tell them it's all a big misunderstanding, that this has to do with him checking the wrong box on a form with the federal government. They were all horrified and very supportive of him at that time.
What Scott and his parishioners don't realise is that Rana Gray is the person responsible for the children being removed from his custody. And it all started with her letter in a Baton Rouge newspaper.
That letter to the editor changed life for everyone involved in this story.
When she wrote this letter to the editor that included Scott Rogers' name in it, and that started this whole chain of events.
A young man living in the UK who had been looking for Scott Rogers for 13 years found my letter to the editor online.
The mysterious young man sends Rana an email. He says he was a former student of Scott's art school in the UK.
I was so shocked at what the email said.
The real story why Scott Rogers emigrated from the UK to the United States.
I don't think anybody had a clue about his past.
There was deception and lies. He fed people a lot of BS.
Shocked by the troubling truth of Scott Rogers, Rana Gray spends the next 10 months putting together the puzzling pieces of his past.
She took it and ran with it, and for someone who had no investigative background, no law enforcement background, Rana Gray just did a tremendous job.
We had 5 or so federal agencies involved. We had 2 U.S. attorneys' offices, Homeland Security, ICE, there were immigration people involved, U.S. Postal Inspection agents.
But little does anyone know that the federal investigation into Scott Rogers will uncover something else startling about him. He didn't just lie on the children's adoption papers.
Apparently, he had lied on some immigration forms he had filled out when he come to the States.
It's a felony offense.
Federal agents felt they had enough to take this before a federal grand jury.
The screws tighten on Scott even further when Kimberly, Stuart and Matthew receive subpoenas to testify in his fraud case.
So this is just building more and more frustration for Scott Rogers. If it comes to light that the applications to get into the United States were fraudulent. Well, guess what happens? You're deported back to the UK.
He was scared to death. And that's when everything started going downhill for Scott.
He was worried that the government was coming to get him. It was basically driving him crazy. Scott believed that the government was watching him and monitoring him, and he believed that they could tap in and listen to any conversations through cell phones. So he wouldn't allow guests at the house to bring cell phones into the house. He had to turn them off and leave them on a little table in the entryway to the house.
Scott also fears that the security cameras inside his home may be compromised.
Scott believed that they could possibly tap in and view his cameras. They were all turned and pointed up to the ceiling where they couldn't catch any footage in the house.
Not knowing who to trust or what other secrets and lies could get exposed, Scott Rogers attempts to escape his troubles.
He was very emotional. He was mixing painkillers with alcohol.
And his downward spiral continues out of the house.
I remember thinking, I wonder where he gets his money. I can't imagine this show generates much income. There's got to be some other revenue stream coming in.
He was considered somewhat of a high roller at the casino in Baton Rouge, and he was seen there almost every night.
And he wasn't winning. He was losing.
So he had debt. And some people who develop a gambling problem, I'm told, keep thinking they're going to hit the big payday and it's going to be worth it.
Scott's family doesn't know what to do.
They're seeing him spiraling out of control. They're just thinking, oh my God, he's going through so much.
I can't imagine how upsetting it was for them.
In the days leading up to the grand jury convening to hear witnesses, Scott had arranged something of a family dinner at the house. Scott was struggling with everything that was going on, and he thought that he was feeling like the end was near.
Fortunately, Scott's friend and co-pastor is there to offer support.
I think he knew they were about to deport him or he was going to go to jail.
The stress affects the whole family. But the show must go on, and Stuart is happy to get away to do some work at the studio.
One evening, Stuart was at the studio in Baton Rouge.
Stuart ends up closing up. He goes to take the garbage out.
From what I understand, he walked out toward the dumpster.
Then Stuart is seen getting into a black vehicle.
And nobody had seen or heard from him since then.
Maybe he's been kidnapped.
He had disappeared.
Scott and his family are in turmoil, deeply troubled by the mysterious disappearance of Stuart, who may have secrets of his own.
Stuart was at the studio in Baton Rouge, and he went to take the trash out, and he got into a car and left from the studio area. His family were concerned about his well-being because they hadn't seen or heard from him in a couple of days.
There's this fear something is wrong.
So what happened to Stuart? Scott has secrets and a growing list of enemies. Is it possible one of them was behind Stuart's disappearance? And who were the two men in the car?
We don't know.
And so there was a lot of confusion, I think, among everyone of what was going on.
Luckily, Scott is able to obtain the surveillance footage of the outside trash area.
So this is actually all caught on video. Stuart goes to take the garbage out and walks to this black vehicle with two people.
It's scary.
They are possibly assuming he's been kidnapped or he's been picked up by officials to be questioned about Scott Rogers.
There was a level of paranoia, especially on Scott's part.
He went into a total panic about it. Stuart's missing. They took the children and now he's disappeared.
I can't imagine how that must have made that congregation feel.
They came together. They had his back.
With Scott in deep crisis, Matthew contacts WAFB-TV, the station that airs around town, and tells them the show is cancelled due to a family catastrophe. And Maria goes to Scott's home to support the family in their time of need.
Maria had been staying with Scott Rogers, doing her part to just whatever she can do to be there for a friend, for her co-pastor.
Maria was very concerned about the well-being of Scott.
He hadn't slept in 2 or 3 days.
Scott is not only despondent about the missing Stuart, the grand jury into his immigration status is looming.
The federal government was going to have him deported for the false information he put on his immigration paperwork.
I can imagine he was scared to death.
He was a man who was used to having control over everything, and now his control was starting to unravel and be lost.
His world was crumbling.
It's early in the morning before the grand jury hearing for Scott Rogers, and Scott and Matthew have been up all night. Around 5 a.m, Maria is awakened by voices downstairs.
Scott and Matt had stayed up all night and weren't sleeping.
They're roaming the house, agitated.
She has no idea what's going on.
She saw Scott and Matthew prepare a number of documents.
Scott Rogers looks at Maria with a soul-searching gaze and passes her some documents and envelopes, then brushes past her to bed.
He believed that he was going to be deported after the grand jury convened.
He started talking to her about how scared he was. I believe Scott even asked her to say prayers over him.
Scott and Matthew are exhausted and distraught as the long night turns to morning. Hours later, what everyone has been dreading has arrived. It's time to leave for the grand jury.
Scott's daughter, Kimmy, had been called before the federal grand jury. Matthew had been called, and Stuart had been called.
But with the family in serious turmoil, Matthew decides he's not going to testify.
Kimmy was leaving to go to the grand jury. He said, "I'm not going." He was staying there with Scott at the house.
There's that fear deep inside that everything is about to come to light.
Across town, with Stuart still unaccounted for and Matthew a no-show, Kimberly does her duty and prepares to testify.
Kimmy was at the federal courthouse in Baton Rouge to testify in front of the grand jury into the inquiry into Scott Rogers.
None of the proceedings, to my knowledge, actually got underway.
Back at the house, Maria Edwards nervously stands by the front door, looking out the window, fearing the immigration authorities will storm the property at any moment.
Maria was very distraught and was very concerned about Scott.
The world around Scott Rogers is in deadly crisis as shocking secrets blast to the surface. Just before 1 p.m. on the first day of Scott Rogers' grand jury hearing, the tranquility of this quiet family neighbourhood is shattered by 2 loud blasts.
911, what's the emergency?
The Iberville Parish Sheriff's Office receives a distressing 911 phone call from a woman at Scott's residence.
I just heard another noise. Oh my God!
She was very distraught and upset.
The caller identifies herself as Maria Edwards.
Ma'am? You gone. Do something. I just have to know if you can you please send somebody over very quickly, please. A gun? What happened?
She had heard some loud pops that she believed to be gunshots.
She was frantic.
Can you please send somebody over very, very quickly, please?
And she says, just get here. Just hurry up and get here right now.
Oh, my God.
And so they dispatched Everville Parish Sheriff's Office to the scene.
When we arrived on the scene, we were met by Maria Edwards. Maria was very distraught.
Also on the scene are investigators Laurie Morgan and Ronnie Hebert.
We had to find out what was going on.
We made our way up the stairs. We proceeded to the door and opened the door to the bedroom.
Inside, they make a grisly discovery.
We saw Scott Rogers laying in the bed with a large amount of blood.
He had one single gunshot wound to the forehead.
It looked like he was just shot right where he laid.
Everybody was, like, oh my God, who would do that to Scott Rogers?
And as we got more into the room, we could see some feet on the other side of the bed.
The other victim is soon identified as Matthew, one of the residents of the house.
We observed a gun laying on the floor next to Matthew, as well as what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his head.
But Matthew still has vital signs.
They called EMS immediately, and he was airlifted to a nearby hospital.
If Matthew survived, eventually Matthew may open up and talk about what all happened.
Unfortunately, Matthew never makes it off life support and dies from the gunshot injury, leaving detectives to solve the mystery.
And then as the scene unfolds, as you're in there photographing and finding evidence, the first thing we assumed was that it was murder-suicide.
But nobody knew what had happened. It was too premature to make a call.
It was just a bizarre crime scene. It really was.
Local news outlets hear about Scott and Matthew's deaths and are now at the scene.
That was an instant story. This was a hot topic.
I was a reporter in Baton Rouge at that time. We're all working our sources. We're trying to find out a little more detail.
Word has also reached Scott's parishioners.
There was maybe 10 to 20 people out there on the street in front of the residence during the investigation, visibly upset and crying and shocked about what had happened.
While all of this is unfolding, authorities inform Kimberly of the tragedy.
She was in court in Baton Rouge at the time.
When they got word that there'd been a shooting at the house.
Kimberly is devastated. So the grand jury is adjourned just as new startling facts about her deceased father were about to be made public.
We learned that Scott Rogers had actually changed his name about 5 times over the course of his life.
His real name is actually Richard Scott Rogers.
And when filling out his immigration paperwork, Scott Rogers used variations of his name and did not disclose information about the previous case that he had been charged with while in the UK.
And what he was charged with shocks investigators.
Scott Rogers, as it turned out, was a child molester.
Scott Rogers had been accused of sexually abusing a young boy when he was running the Performing Arts Academy in Bury St. Edmunds. And he wasn't the only one who was sexually abused.
It turns out Ethan was one of them, and now as an adult, after hunting Scott for years, he shared his story with Rana.
He mentioned in the email that there'd been a court case involving one of the young boys abused by Scott. The tabloids were just going crazy with this story.
But during the trial, it was the boy's word against one of the most respected people in the community.
It's almost no surprise that the trial ended in a hung jury.
He was acquitted of them charges.
But the negative publicity generated by the trial severely damaged Scott's reputation. His wife soon divorced him, enrollment in his arts academy dropped, and so Richard Scott Rogers fled to the US to start a new life under his new name.
So in his head, nobody's going to find him. He has escaped his deep, dark secret.
So he came here determined to not get caught again.
Investigators wonder, was Scott's shameful secret somehow related to his and Matthew's deaths?
Nobody knew what had happened. We had to find out what was going on, put that puzzle together, and then we'll make a determination as to what we think happened.
At the crime scene, they find some disturbing evidence. Several blood-stained notes.
It appeared that they were suicide notes written by Matthew.
And others containing instructions for Maria Edwards.
All kind of account and personal information.
There were also very explicit directions on how to sell off businesses and how to handle the finances.
It seemed like everything was being left with Maria in charge.
We found some wills that were written by Scott Rogers.
And they name Maria Edwards as the sole beneficiary.
It was shocking.
It appears she benefited greatly from the deaths of Scott and Matthew.
It was very concerning that she was in the house at the time it happened and that he had changed his wills, leaving everything to her. Scott had his security systems in the house, and it was very suspicious to us that the cameras were turned up to where they could not film any activities in the house.
The police want Maria to answer some serious questions, but she isn't cooperating.
And she didn't want to talk to them without a lawyer.
So why would you need an attorney?
Maria's behavior was very abnormal, so we felt that there might have been a little bit more going on there that she wasn't telling us.
Detectives wonder if Maria Edwards may have information about Scott Rogers and Matthew's mysterious deaths.
We learned that Miss Maria seemed like she was going to benefit from this.
He left all his fortune to her. He left everything to Maria, yet he left nothing for his own daughter, his own biological daughter.
So, to me, she was a suspect.
But at that time, we still had no evidence to link Maria into being involved in what happened upstairs.
She continued to say, I needed my attorney present. And finally, about 9 days after the shooting, she arranges to go in with her lawyer and do her interview.
Chris Alexander, who is apparently the attorney for Miss Maria Edwards. She was very nervous.
Maria did deny any knowledge of knowing that Scott had ever molested any children.
All I saw from him was doing good, doing good, doing good.
She got fooled by Scott Rogers. She got duped just like everybody else. Could you tell us what transpired that day?
She gave us a little bit of background on how Scott had been distraught about everything going on in his life.
He was desperate, he was crying.
Maria says after Kimmy left for court, Matthew and Scott went upstairs to Scott's bedroom.
I stayed downstairs, and now I'm waiting to hear from Kimmy about the court, what's happening in the jury. At the same time, I'm looking at all the cars because every noise, a truck or a car or something, well, they're going to come and pick them up. They're going to take them. And as I was doing that downstairs, I heard a shot, and I was freaked out. And I heard a second detonation.
Did Matthew or Scott tell you that I'm going to shoot myself, or Matthew's going to shoot me, or anything like that? Never discussed.
Never discussed. Never in my wildest dreams.
We truly believe that she was downstairs when it happened.
But they need to be certain.
She going to submit to the DNA?
Yes, and I already told her about that.
Okay.
And I appreciate y'all doing it at the end of the interview.
Your DNA will be compared to the DNA on the weapon.
And the results clear Maria of any suspicion of wrongdoing.
Matthew was the only one that fired the gun. Maria was definitely downstairs at the time of the shooting.
It was a murder-suicide. His own son-in-law shot and killed him before he killed himself.
In the end, he was too cowardly to just take his own life.
Investigators soon learn that's the reason why Stuart disappeared.
Originally, Scott had talked to him about killing him and then killing himself.
Stuart wanted no part of that, and so he wanted to get out. So he arranged an escape, essentially.
He reached out to a federal agent, and then, from what I understand, 2 federal agents arrived the next day. They put him in their unit and took off with him to put him in protection.
Stuart agrees to be interviewed by Iberville Parish investigators, where he will eventually expose even more shocking secrets about Scott Rogers.
I've been through a lot of interviews, but that was probably one of the most interesting and heartbreaking interviews I've ever been a part of.
I met Scott Rogers when I was 12 years old. My parents met Scott with me, and Scott extended me a full scholarship at his performing arts school. By the time I was 13, he was engaging in sexual abuse with me as a kid. There were at least 3 other kids that I know of.
One of them was Matthew.
That, to me, is mind-blowing.
He basically manipulated Matthew and Stuart to live with him.
The truth is, if when I was like 17, you could have come down with an army and I wouldn't have left that man.
He basically brainwashed these kids into coming to the United States with him.
And Kimmy had actually married Matthew at Scott's request to help with the citizenship process.
It was a cover marriage to get him into the States legally.
But Scott's dark past would eventually catch up with him. And this time, he's unable to escape it.
He had built such a public persona of respectability, and he knew that was over, and that he was going to be exposed for what he really was, and I guess his ego just couldn't stand to go on like that.
So he chose to take the easy way out.
And unfortunately, Matthew's been brainwashed for 23 years, so he does. He shoots him first, and then he turns the gun on himself and shoots himself in the head.
I don't shed any tears over Scott Rogers' demise, and I don't think a lot of people do.
There's no telling how many victims Scott Rogers would have left in his wake had this not come to light.
And it all started with Ronna Gray's letter.
I still get emotional recounting this whole saga. This little letter to the editor changed everything. I don't know that Scott Rogers would have ever been exposed for what he really was.
This makes me realize that a lot of people do have secrets and hide things, and you don't always know their true ways.
I was a police officer for 32 years, and I learned, as every police officer does, that there's evil in the world. What's hard to accept, though, is that they don't look like monsters. They don't wear a name tag or a shirt that says, I'm dangerous, I'm evil, I'm a child molester. The ones that are the most dangerous are the ones that you trust.
Good friend of the show is Colonel Michael Edmondson.
I don't ever want to meet another Scott Rogers. I don't ever want to investigate another crime like this.
And I pray that all of his victims, be it people in the UK or be it here, they have the strength to move forward.